The scariest thing in all the regulations that no one is aware of. I mean, I'm constantly harping on the chronically leaking appliance rule. It's something in commercial refrigeration. People should be absolutely terrified of it.
Yes.
Many people, unfortunately, are not even aware of it. You wouldn't believe the people who reach out to me and I happen to mention it. They've never heard of it.
Mhm.
And it turns out, wow, it's been in effect since 2019. And at that point in time, they realized that they were supposed to submit reports to the EPA.
Is that
They
me?
didn't know about it and they didn't.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again on Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC podcast. So today we're spending time with Keilly Witman from Refrigerant Management Solutions, the nation's expert in end user refrigerant management. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
You know, I was just telling you before we started this podcast, I can't believe we haven't ran into each other in the industry before. You have been involved in so many aspects of our industry, NASRC, the Green Chill Initiative, all things that you have initiated. And I don't know where I've been this whole time.
It's certainly been exciting and I enjoy it. So it's great to be part of things like this to get the word out to everybody about things that are going on. This is a great opportunity.
Yeah, I absolutely love being at this place in time in our industry. It's very different than when I was brought up in the industry in the 1990s. I was a refrigeration technician. I started out with small light commercial applications, then got into grocery refrigeration and industrial, as well as HVAC. But back then, I was working on a lot of conversions and retrofits, especially R12 systems in grocery stores, mom and pop restaurants. I did a lot of that type of work. And we did speak a lot about refrigerant management and understanding best practices and what was required in commercial that was different than in residential. And that norm, like many things in our industry, hadn't changed for a long time. But these last few years have really been an interesting place, especially in the commercial refrigeration sector when it comes to refrigerant management. I'd like to call this one clarifying the confusion.
Good luck. So,
Yeah.
well, I'll certainly do my best, that's for sure. But honestly, there seems to be a bit of confusion just baked into the new regulations. I know we have been trying to work with the EPA to get answers to some questions that are just really baffling to people out there in terms of trying to figure out how to make sure that you're in compliance. There's some stuff just baked into the regulations that makes it very difficult. So I've never experienced the level of confusion that I'm experiencing on a daily basis right now in terms of people calling. And certainly there are several questions that I think everybody is confused about. And there's no, until the EPA gives us some answers on some of this stuff, we're just all in the same boat. So I feel like the previous regulations under Title VI of the Clean Air Act that related to R22, we pretty much knew what was going on. You know,
Right.
we had our definitions, we had the way it was supposed to work. The regulations were pretty clear. Some of these new regulations encompass, new terms, completely new concepts, completely new ways of doing things. And I think the EPA didn't realize some of the things that were causing confusion. They're now getting a lot of feedback on that. And I think they're trying to straighten it all out. It takes time. Unfortunately, at the same time, these regulations, some of them, like the technology transitions rule, they go into effect on January 1st, 2025. So
Exactly.
we need answers, and unfortunately, we're not getting them fast enough. So it's a pretty precarious situation out there.
You know, many of us were comfortable with our previous requirements, and we've had some changes in we've noticed, particularly these last 4 or 5 years or so, we have noticed that there's been some changes in administration, which always affects the way communication happens within any organization. But we do have these things like the technology transition rule, and much of our audience is probably unfamiliar with the things that have been presented to us through things like the technology transition rule. Can you give us a kind of an overview of some of these changes of the things that people may not be aware of?
Yeah, I think the technology transitions rule is a really good place to start because that's the type of thing that is completely new, right? So when
Right.
you take the AIM Act as a whole, there are three parts really that affect us. Two of them we're fairly familiar with, but the technology transitions rule is just a completely new approach. And what that does is it sets global warming potential limits that determine which refrigerants you're allowed to use in the different, we call them end use equipment categories.
Yes.
So it just says, okay, for air conditioning package units, as of this date, you're only allowed to use refrigerants with certain global warming potentials, right? It has to be under a certain level. There's a different date for compliance, for instance, refrigeration racks for supermarkets. And there's chillers has a different set of timings and a different set of GWP limits. So you really just have to know which equipment sector you're looking at, and then you have to know what the GWP limits are for the refrigerants you're allowed to use. You have to pay attention to the dates that the regulations go into effect, and you have to pay attention to what the compliance date is based on. In some cases, it's based on the manufacture date. In other cases, it's based on the installation date. So there's just a lot of confusion in terms of understanding what are you supposed to be looking at, right? The EPA put out a series of fact sheets with tables that list all the end use sectors, but I know there's a lot of uncertainty. People look at these humongous fact sheets and they're just very uncertain. Am I looking at the right thing? Am I understanding this correctly? And of course, the consequences of making mistakes in those areas are absolutely huge for an equipment manufacturer to have their entire manufacturing set up to use a particular refrigerant. They've got to understand what are the dates where the refrigerant we're currently using is no longer legal, right? You don't want to be shipping illegal equipment to your clients out there, right? You can imagine the disaster that would create. So we're getting a lot of questions with people saying, I read this, I have attended multiple webinars, but I still don't actually know where to look for my stuff, right? Like I do split systems for air conditioning. Which of the 57,000 tables here am I supposed to be looking at for my information? So it's a tough situation to be in.
It really is. I've spent a lot of time focusing in on the residential light commercial aspect of it, looking at our split systems, heat pump installations in particularly, because we have a very confused residential light commercial audience, many of which don't even understand that the HFC phase down through the AIM Act and through the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol have initiated this, but things like the technology transition rule have escalated even those. And so when we look at the equipment, we have to understand, are we looking at systems? Are we looking at components? Where do they fall in that?
That's right.
And it's very important for us to understand that not every manufacturer has read that exactly the same. So I've had
Yes.
the fortunate opportunity to be invited to a couple different manufacturing facilities over the last few months. One manufacturer of residential light commercial equipment, they decided that they were going to go ahead and convert all of their residential split system lines ahead of time to be fully compliant. So they have no R410A residential systems in manufacturing at this time. They've completely transitioned over through the summer, which is why we had a shortage of 2-ton and 3-ton residential split system outdoor
Oh,
units, because that transition was already being made. And so it took
yeah.
time to convert lines. And then at another facility I went to, they're riding it out to the very end. They're going to be manufacturing R410A equipment until midnight of December 31st. And then they're going to make their final equipment transition, and then they're going to go over to the refrigerant of their choice. So different manufacturers have approached that from different aspects. And so it really is going to come down to inventory. Whatever is
Yeah.
left is going to be it. And so some of our contractors are looking at it going, But I've got this sell through period. I'm going to focus on this sell through period, and I'll just grab what I need to from my local distributor and I will sell that through the sell through. And in some cases, that sell through is not going to make it that entire time.
Well, and also the sell through period and the manufacturing date compliance dates, they are only even relevant for certain types of products, right?
Exactly.
So the EPA created these two types of appliances. Now, it used to be you just, well, there was this term appliance right from the beginning in the regulations, which has always been really problematic because regular people out there in the real world don't talk in terms of appliances. They talk about equipment and units and things like that. So, but in general, now on top of just understanding what an appliance is, which is the foundation of all the regulations, they've created two types, right? So your pre-charged packaged air conditioning units that are basically, ready to go
Window units,
from the
PPAP.
factory, they've got all the refrigerant in them. There you've got that manufacturing date as the compliance deadline, and there is a certain sell-through period as long as the units have been manufactured prior to that deadline. However, you take something that is installed out in the field,
Mm-hmm.
right, set up, field installed and charged out in the field,
Mm-hmm.
there the compliance date is not based on manufacture, it's based on installation, right? So you have to, the manufacturing date is pretty irrelevant, right? And you know, the EPA postponed one of those dates for air conditioning split systems because people rightly pointed out, since the deadline for this is based on installation, actually the deadline for us to purchase and order these systems is way before January 1st, 2025, if
Months,
you
9 months
make
before.
that as the deadline, right? Because I've
Absolutely.
got to order that well in advance in order to be able to have it installed by January 1st. So they had to change that whole system around, and as long as all the components have been manufactured, prior to the deadline, you've got until January 1st, 2026 actually now to install it. So it's really, I think it's hard for people to understand. The way I explain it to myself is, I basically say the reason the EPA had to come up with those two different types of deadlines is for something that's installed out in the field, like take a refrigeration rack system, right? If you wanted to set a manufacturing date as the compliance deadline, well, the manufacturing date of what, right?
What component?
Of the compressor,
Right.
of the copper piping, of the cases, right? You're putting together a whole bunch of different things that are manufactured by different companies. Even it's very common for people to buy their rack skid for the machine room from one company and to buy their cases from a
Individual pieces.
completely different company.
Absolutely.
So I think that helps people understand. That's why the EPA couldn't use manufacture date for that equipment that is installed out in the field. So I always find it helpful if you understand, why the EPA is doing something. I find that it's easier then to understand how you need to comply with it.
That's a really good aspect. That's a great way to frame that because when we look at what was the EPA's design, what was the EPA's intention? Well, the EPA's intention was to start this back in the Kigali Amendment. I mean, we went through 3 presidents before it finally got signed.
Yeah.
So we had to move it forward. And so we reintroduced it through a Jobs Act, through the AIM Act, and finally got a president to sign off. Well, then we have kind of a bipartisan. We have two different phase downs that look identical, one signed by a Republican, one signed by a Democrat. And then finally we're going, okay, we're finally doing this thing. After a decade or so, we're actually going to start this HFC phase down. And the EPA steps in and says, okay, we're behind track. Let's see if we can move this forward a little bit better. And let's clarify some of these end users. And let's set some GWP limits on these different end users so that we can help move this along a little bit faster. But the consequence ended up being this exact scenario that we're talking about. Now we end up with all of these different end users and very few of them looking the same. So with our residential like commercial, it's actually not too difficult. I mean, there's confusion in there because now we got to look at it as, all right, was this manufactured as an assembly, or am I installing this and completing the assembly in the field? But I've got one GWP that I got to focus on, and so we can come up with
Yes.
whatever refrigerant based on this. If I'm a commercial refrigeration technician, woo,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a whole nother story.
That's absolutely correct. Even understanding which category you're in when you're talking about commercial refrigeration is crazy because light commercial means something different in the technology transitions rule versus the definition of that evidently in the what I call the third part, which is the emissions reduction and reclamation regulations. Evidently, light commercial suddenly does not mean what we always thought that it meant, one of the biggest areas of confusion. I will say, though, one benefit in commercial refrigeration and air conditioning, you don't have something that I find very unfortunate that does happen in the residential space. And I actually myself have received two mailers in the mail telling me that I needed to get ahead of the mandatory switch
Mm.
in technologies. And I, open this up and I look at it and I just think, so either this is deliberately not true, which I hope is not the case, or it represents a complete misunderstanding of the requirements here. And those messages unfortunately get passed on to homeowners. At least in the commercial sector, you've got knowledgeable people and you've got a lot of resources, people like us, right? You can give us a call, we can explain it to you. And at the residential level, right there, who does a homeowner reach out to find out whether their service technician is telling them the truth or not? There's no requirement under the technology transitions rule that you change what you're currently using. I'm I don't even know whether I want to say this and something that's going to be public, but I just moved into a house last year. And one of the first things I did was I crawled behind the bushes to look at the back of my air conditioning unit. And I saw to my astonishment, my air conditioning system still uses R22,
There's a lot of,
right?
yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
there's a lot of them out there, but I'm receiving, like I said, I received two notices in the mail from different, manufacturer or from different actually service companies in my area who were sending the message out to homeowners that you're not going to be allowed to use your existing equipment anymore.
Man, that's just,
So you have a lot of misinformation, unfortunately, in the residential sector.
yeah, and you're right. There, who polices that? Is that
That's right.
EPA governance that doesn't have the manpower to facilitate? Is that a Better Business Bureau?
That's right.
Unfortunately, there are so many organizations that are not aware. We're here at ESCO, we actually do a lot of training with home inspectors and with building inspectors on what the regulations look like just for residential only. And many of them come to us going, "But I heard this." And we
That's
go,
right.
"I I don't even wanna know where you heard it from. Just make sure you start looking to the right places for information." So
That's right.
many organizations and jurisdictions within our own industry are struggling to find the correct resources. So from the residential homeowner perspective, it is a very scary place to be. And so that is part of this awareness. That is part of this campaign, is to be able to reach out to residential, like commercial contractors and technicians. And I hope if you're listening to this or if you're watching this episode, you're realizing that there is a sense of emergency in our industry, and that emergency is to become well educated and to pass
That's
that
right.
on.
That's right. Somebody asked me a couple months ago, do I know whether I'm on a do not respond list for residential air conditioning? And I said, what? Why?
Mm.
And they said, well, because can you imagine being the service technician for your home air conditioner who shows up at Keilly Witman's house and starts explaining about the new refrigerant regulations to you? And I laughed and I said, that happened to me in Texas, actually,
Yeah.
where I had a technician tell me that no, it's not worth bothering to repair the leak in my air conditioning system. He was just going to top it off. And I had to unfortunately explain to him that was not going to be acceptable for me.
That's
And
right.
I told him why. And, he got a little white when I told him about that I used to work in this area at the EPA. And I'm pretty sure that if I had called him a second time, he would not have come to my house. But yeah, I feel sorry for a lot of these people because let's face it, there's just so much to do, so little time. Unfortunately, a lot of companies out there do not do a great job educating their employees. They read things on Facebook or online, and who knows if they're true, especially the ones who are trying to do their best to inform themselves, but there is a lot of misinformation out there. So it's not always intentional on their part. The information comes to them already, they're just getting some bad information too. So it's not always that somebody is deliberately trying to be misleading. It's hard on top of your regular job to then spend the time to educate yourself. So this type of podcast is fantastic, a lot of information in a short period of time with reliable sources for information. So this is great.
Yeah, that's really the goal. We have an entire low GWP safety training program that is focused towards educators and students and technicians, but we also need those additional resources. And you do a lot of training classes when you're just talking about the finding the leak. I just happened to find the article. You have a class called the Chronically Leaking Appliance Rule. So
That's right. That's right. The scariest thing in all the regulations that no one is aware of. I mean, I'm constantly harping on the chronically leaking appliance rule. It's something in commercial refrigeration. People should be absolutely terrified of it.
yes.
Many people, unfortunately, are not even aware of it. You wouldn't believe the people who reach out to me and I happen to mention it. They've never heard of it.
Mhm.
And it turns out, wow, it's been in effect since 2019. And at that point in time, they realized that they were supposed to submit reports to the EPA.
Is that
They
me?
didn't know about it and they didn't, right?
Exactly.
So luckily, up until now, it has only been a problem for people who were still using R22,
Right.
right? But moving forward under the emissions
Story.
reduction and reclamation regulations that go into effect on January 1st, 2026, just imagine now that all of the HFC appliances with 15 or more pounds fall under that new regulation. Some people who have had no regulated appliances for all these years because they're completely out of the HCFC refrigerants, all of a sudden they've got 50,000, 60,000 regulated appliances that they're having to deal with. So I just keep telling people, okay, it's one thing to not know about this reporting requirement to the EPA, up to now, but as of 2026, certainly in commercial refrigeration, I don't think there's going to be anybody that does not have chronically leaking appliances that need to
Agreed.
be reported.
Yeah.
Up to now, if the EPA didn't receive any reports from you, they didn't know whether it was that you failed to report or whether you just didn't have any HCFC appliances and therefore did not have to report.
Mhm.
But as of 2026, if you're not sending in chronically leaking appliance reports, it's going to be a pretty safe assumption on the EPA enforcement area side that you just failed to submit your reports.
Yeah. Wow.
So,
A lot
because
of
as
change.
much progress as we've made on the leak front, especially in a commercial refrigeration setting, some leaks are just out of your control. And the reason for the leak doesn't matter, right? So somebody crawls up on your roof and steals your copper piping and you lose your entire charge. You suddenly realize for the calendar year, you've got 125% leak rate. It can happen very, very easily. So even though many of the requirements in the new regulation are the same as the old requirements, there's a lot of people out there that just have not had to worry about compliance because they were really early with getting out of R22 and all of their equipment. So
Exactly.
now they got to start paying attention again.
Wow. A lot of changes to especially our commercial contractors. If I am
Yeah.
a commercial contractor or I'm a compliance officer for my company and I need to learn more, how can I connect with you?
Oh, well, we have a website. It's refrigerantmanagementsolutions.com. I know that's quite a lot to type in and type in correctly. We do have a shorter version,
Mhm.
which is just dcerms.com. So that's just 9 letters. So that's a little bit easier. But either one of those, we have a pretty large presence on LinkedIn. We have a supermarket refrigeration management LinkedIn group with a couple thousand people. We
Nice.
post all our news on there. We have a newsletter that we send out every month with all the new stuff that people need to be aware of. You can sign up for that on our website. We have a training program. It's just called the RMS training program.
Mhm.
We try to do a new training every 2 weeks. We keep it as low cost as we possibly can just to cover our costs because
Sure.
our goal is to educate people. So there are lots of trainings that are just, $39.99. I think the most expensive one I think is $99.99 when we do it for several hours.
Mhm.
We try to keep it affordable. We do everything we can. The NASRC is certainly a really good resource. Their mission is not compliance, though, right? Their focus is natural refrigerants, but still they try to do what they can in terms of helping people. They have webinars, things like that on the AIM Act. There's a lot out there. You do, though, have to take the time to educate yourself. It's unfortunately, we're not yet at the stage where you can just press a button on your head and all this knowledge just automatically gets downloaded, right? You have to make an effort. And I really worry about people who don't make that effort because in the past, I know the most common compliance strategy out there was stick your head in the sand and hope the EPA doesn't notice
My
you,
door.
right? It's not going to be possible anymore because there's just nobody out there that doesn't fall under these regulations. I know for a fact there's no supermarket company out there that uses, all CO2 in their refrigeration systems, or at least no large company, right? There might be small, people family owned like one single store maybe, but this just affects everybody and you've got to take a little bit of time. Certainly it's worth it to to go to somebody that can digest it for you. We have fact sheets too online. We try to boil everything down to just one page, right? Of here's what you need to know, the most important stuff, here's what's changing. That's not easy to take something that's a regulation that's a couple hundred pages long and try to boil it down to one page,
Exactly.
but we try to do it. So a lot of people out there are trying to help, but unfortunately, the people that are dealing with this every day, they need to take a little bit of time. I think if you're a service contractor, especially in commercial refrigeration,
Mhm.
if you're dealing with end users who have compliance people and operations people, they're the ones who carry the liability for these violations. So they are actually watching, the records that you're entering, right? So take a half hour to understand what you have to do because it saves a world of time later with them making you go in and changing your records and correcting them. And you know maybe they come to you a couple months after the fact and they say, hey, this record is wrong, or from what you wrote in this record, it looks like you created a violation for us, and then you've got to hunt down the paperwork from a couple months ago. Not educating yourself definitely takes longer in the long run than the time you need to take to educate yourself.
That is a great statement right there. Keilly Witman, thank you for clarifying some of the confusion. And we encourage everyone to go learn more at Refrigerant Management Solutions. And we thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, and good luck to everybody out there. It's not an easy life right now, but you can do it. I know you can.